The morning I walked into that conference room, I was wearing my mother's watch. It was an old thing, a thin gold Seiko she'd bought herself when she got her first paycheck as a nurse's aide back in 1987. The clasp was worn. The face was scratched in one corner. I'd had it resized twice because her wrists were smaller than mine, and even then it slid around when I moved my hand. I almost didn't wear it that day. I almost left it on the nightstand next to my coffee mug and my half-eaten piece of toast. I'm glad I didn't. I'm going to tell you something I'd never told anyone outside of the people who were in that room. Not my coworkers, not my college friends, not even my therapist. Not the full version anyway. But I think it needs to be said out loud because I spent 11 years convinced I was the problem. 11 years believing what they told me, that I was difficult, that I was ungrateful, that the reason I didn't fit was something broken inside me, not something broken in them. My name is Elaine. I'm 32 years old. And this is the story of the day I stopped apologizing for existing. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. You can't understand what happened in that conference room without understanding where I came from. My father left when I was 4. I don't have memories of him leaving. I have memories of him just not being there anymore. The way you notice a tooth is gone more than you notice the moment it fell out. My mother raised me alone in a small house in eastern Ohio, working double shifts, clipping coupons, driving a car that made a sound like a dying animal every time she turned the heat on. She never complained about it. Not once. She used to say, "We're not poor, we're resourceful." I believed her. I still do. She met my stepfather, I'll call him Douglas, when I was 9. He came with a house that had central air conditioning and a backyard and 2 kids from his first marriage, a son named Brett, who was 12, and the daughter named Kelsey, who was 7. My mother looked at that house and that man, and I think she allowed herself to believe, for the first time in years, that things were going to be okay. For about 18 months, they were. Douglas was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Loudly. Publicly. In ways that made other people in the room feel warmed by the performance. He coached Brett's Little League team. He made pancakes on Sunday mornings in the shape of states and quizzed us on the capitals. He called my mother sweetheart in front of the neighbors. He was the kind of man who knew exactly how he looked from the outside. Inside the house was a different geometry. It started small. The way it always starts small. He had opinions about how I spoke at the dinner table. I was too loud, or I was too quiet, or I interrupted, or I sulked. Whatever I did was evidence of some flaw that needed correcting. Brett and Kelsey seemed exempt from this. Or maybe I was just too young to notice that he had different flavors of cruelty for different people. By the time I was 13, I learned to make myself small. I ate quickly. I did my homework in my room. I agreed with things I didn't agree with. I got very good at reading the air in a room, the temperature of Douglas's mood, the particular silence that meant he was building towards something. My mother saw it. I know she saw it because sometimes she would look at me with this expression I can only describe as apologetic helplessness, like she knew something was wrong but couldn't find the language for it or couldn't afford the cost of naming it. She'd worked so hard to build this life. I think she was afraid that if she pulled one thread, the whole thing would unravel. When I was 17, I got a scholarship, a real one, full tuition to a university 3 states away for mechanical engineering. I was the first person in my immediate family who'd ever gotten into a 4-year college. I was so proud I actually cried when I opened the letter. I ran downstairs to tell my mother and she hugged me so hard my ribs hurt. Douglas, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, looked up and said, "You'll be back in a semester. Girls like you don't finish." I did not go back in a semester. I finished. I got my degree. I got a master's. I got a job at an engineering firm in Charlotte, North Carolina that I worked at for 6 years until I was headhunted by a defense contractor, where I now lead a team of 14 people and hold 3 patents. I am telling you these things not to brag. I am telling you because Douglas spent 11 years telling me I was nothing, and I want you to understand exactly how wrong he was. I married my husband. His name is Jonathan, 4 years ago. He is a patent attorney. He is quiet and methodical and funny in this dry, understated way that took me about 3 months to fully appreciate, and he has never once in 6 years of knowing me made me feel like I was too much or too little or the wrong shape. I told him everything about my childhood on our second date, sitting at a bar in uptown Charlotte, and he listened to the whole thing without interrupting. And then he said, That man should not have been allowed near children. And I thought, yes, exactly. Someone finally said it. I had not spoken to Douglas in 4 years when his lawyer called me. His name was Mr. Dunmore, Douglas's lawyer, and he left a voicemail so formal it sounded like he was reading from a script. Miss Elaine Hartwell, I'm calling regarding the estate of your stepfather. It's important that you attend the reading of the will. There are matters that concern you directly. I sat in my car in the parking garage at work and listened to that voicemail 3 times. I called Jonathan. He said, "Do you want to go?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "Then we'll go. And if you decide when we're there that you want to leave, we leave." That's the kind of man he is. I want to pause here and explain something, because it's the thing the comments always ask about when I've mentioned parts of this story before, and I want to be honest about it. People ask, why did you go back? You were free. You were successful. Why walk into that room? And the answer is complicated, but I'll try. Douglas had been my stepfather for 9 years. My mother had been married to him for over a decade before their divorce. He was, by legal definition, part of the estate process in ways that touched on my mother, on money she may or may not have been entitled to during their marriage, on assets that predated or overlapped with her contributions to the household. My mother had passed away 18 months prior, and I had never gotten closure on what she had or hadn't been left with. There was also a specific piece of property, a lake house in western North Carolina that my mother had loved, that I had spent summers in as a teenager, that she had told me once, very quietly, was originally purchased with money from her parents. Her money, not his. I was not going back for Douglas. I was going back for her. We drove up on a Tuesday in October. The law offices were in a suburb of Cleveland, a brick building with a parking lot full of BMWs that told you everything you needed to know about the kind of law they practiced. Jonathan wore his gray suit. I wore a blazer and my mother's watch. Brett was already in the conference room when we arrived. He was 41 now, heavy-set with his father's jaw and his father's way of taking up space. He looked at me when I walked in the way. You look at something you're surprised is still alive. Kelsey was there too, seated beside her husband. She gave me a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. We had never been close. Not enemies exactly, more like people who happened to share a mailing address for a few years. Douglas was at the head of the table. He was 70 now, still upright, still deliberate in his movements, still wearing his wealth the way other men wear cologne. He looked at me for a long moment when I sat down. Then he looked at Jonathan. Then he looked back at me and said, "I didn't expect you to actually come." I said, "I know." Mr. Dunmore began. The estate was substantial, the house, investment accounts, a small commercial property. He went through the allocations methodically. Brett received the commercial property. Kelsey received a cash settlement and the house. Then Mr. Dunmore cleared his throat. He said, "There is an additional provision in the will regarding the property known as Lakeview, located in Watauga County, North Carolina." I went very still. "This property," Mr. Dunmore continued, "was originally acquired in 1994 using funds documented as a gift from the estate of Robert and Helen Marsh, parents of the decedent's former spouse, Eleanor Marsh Hartwell. My mother. Her parents. Her money. The decedent acknowledged in a codicil added 14 months ago that this property was acquired with funds that originated from Mrs. Hartwell's family, and he's directed that the property be transferred to her surviving daughter, Elaine Hartwell, as a matter of restitution." I heard Jonathan breathe out slowly beside me. I heard Brett say, "What?" I looked at Douglas. He was looking at the table. His hands, folded in front of him, were very still. Brett was on his feet before Mr. Dunmore finished his sentence. He said, "That's not right. That property has been in our family," Mr. Dunmore said very calmly. "In your father's estate, Mr. Douglas. It was never titled in your name." Brett said, "She's not even his real daughter." Jonathan said, "She doesn't need to be." The codicil is clear. The way he said it, quiet, factual, no theater, made Brett go silent in a way that loudness wouldn't have. That's what I mean about Jonathan. He doesn't perform. He just states. But Brett wasn't finished. He turned to me and said, "You manipulated him. Somehow, you got to him. You always had to make everything about you. 11 years of you're too much, and you're the problem, and girls like you don't finish." I looked at my stepbrother. I thought about the 4-year-old girl who just noticed her father wasn't there anymore. I thought about my mother's face, that apologetic helplessness. I thought about the lake house and the summers there, the dock where she used to sit with her coffee in the mornings, the way the light came off the water. I said, that lake house was bought with my grandparents' money. My mother told me that when I was 15. I think you knew that. I think your father knew that. And I think it's been bothering him for longer than 14 months. Brett said, you can't prove. The codicil is a legal document, Jonathan said. Signed, notarized, filed. Proof is what Mr. Sanchez Dunmore has in front of him. Kelsey had not said anything this entire time. I glanced at her. She was looking at her hands. Here's the part I have thought about the most since then. After Brett stormed out, and he did storm out, dramatically, knocking his chair back, and Kelsey quietly followed, and Mr. Dunmore excused himself to make copies of documents, Jonathan and I were left alone in the conference room with Douglas. He was still sitting at the head of the table. He had not moved through any of it. I should have left. I know I should have left. But I sat there for a moment longer than I needed to, and he looked up, and we looked at each other across that long table. He said, I wasn't a good stepfather to you. I said, no, you weren't. He said, your mother deserved better than what I gave her. I wanted to say something sharp. I had years of sharp things stored up, cataloged, filed. But I looked at this old man, 70 years old, estranged from the world he'd spent decades constructing. And I felt something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was not forgiveness. It was more like completion. Like a sentence that had been missing its period finally getting one. I said, yes, she did. And I stood up and I straightened my blazer and Jonathan held the door open for me and we walked out into the October air and I put my face up toward the sun for a moment and I thought about my mother. She had loved that lake house. She had loved the mornings on the dock. She had loved the way the water looked in October, dark and silver and very still. She was gone, but the house was going to be mine. I need to tell you something about the drive home. We stopped at a diner about 40 minutes outside of Cleveland. The kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that tastes like it's been on the burner since morning, which it probably had. And I ordered eggs and toast and I sat across from Jonathan and I cried. Not dramatically, not in the way you cry in movies. Just quietly, the way you do when something that has been held very tightly for a very long time is finally allowed to loosen. Jonathan didn't say anything. He put his hand on the table and I put mine in it and we sat there while the coffee got cold. After a while, he said, do you want to drive up and see it this weekend? I said, yeah, I think I do. We went that Saturday. The lake house was emptier than I remembered, the furniture covered in sheets, the dock weathered, the windows dusty. But the light was the same. The water was the same dark October silver. I stood on the dock for a long time. I'm not someone who believes in signs. I'm an engineer. I believe in load-bearing structures and stress tolerances and things that can be measured. But standing there, in the place my mother had loved, wearing her watch on my wrist, I felt something that I can only describe as her being okay with how things turned out. That might be wishful thinking. I don't care. People sometimes ask me what the lesson is. They want a clean takeaway, a 3-step process, something to screenshot and share. I don't have that. What I have is this. I spent years making myself smaller because a man with a loud voice told me I was too much. I spent years being grateful for the wrong things and apologizing for the right ones. I spent years carrying something that was never mine to carry. And then one Tuesday in October, I sat in a conference room in a suburb of Cleveland, and a lawyer read a document out loud, and a man who had spent 9 years making me feel invisible spent the last chapter of his story trying to make it right. He didn't fully succeed. You can't fully make right the things he did, but he tried, in the only language he had left: legal documents, notarized signatures, a property transfer filed in Watauga County. My mother's watch is on my wrist right now as I tell you this. The clasp is still worn. The face is still scratched. I wouldn't change a single thing about it. If you've ever been told by someone with authority over you that you were the problem, that you were too much, too loud, too ambitious, wrong-shaped for the life they wanted to build, I want you to hear this. The problem was never you. It was the size of their imagination. It was the smallness of what they could tolerate. It was the particular cruelty of people who build themselves up by making others smaller. You don't have to forgive them to be free of them. I want you to understand that. Those are two different things, and you get to choose which ones matter. I chose my mother's lake house. I chose October light on the water. I chose Jonathan holding the door open. I chose the cold diner coffee. and the quiet cry and the drive home through Ohio farm country with the windows cracked and the radio playing something I didn't recognize. I chose all of it. And 11 years late on a Tuesday in October, the world chose me back. I've thought a lot about what Douglas said to me the day I got my scholarship. Not because it haunted me, it used to, but it doesn't anymore. But because of what it reveals about the kind of person he was and the kind of person I chose to become despite him. He said, "Girls like you don't finish." He meant it as a verdict. He delivered it the way people deliver verdicts when they've already decided the outcome and just want to watch you absorb it. What he didn't understand, what people like him never understand, is that words like that don't land the way they're intended. They don't crush, they calcify. They turn into something you carry in your chest that's harder than anything they expected. I finished, and I kept finishing. Not to prove him wrong. I want to be honest about that, because I spent too many years framing my own ambition as a response to his cruelty, and that gives him too much credit. I kept going because I had work to do and a mind that wanted to do it, and a mother who had modeled what it looked like to keep showing up even when things were hard. That's the part that took me a long time to understand. The choices Douglas made, the diminishments, the favoritism, the particular way he looked at me like I was a problem he hadn't asked for, those choices had consequences, not cosmic ones, not some invisible ledger being tallied somewhere, just real, human, accumulated consequences. He built a household on control and conditional worth, and the people inside that household learned to navigate it by becoming smaller or by leaving. I left. And because I left, I built something. And because I built something, I was sitting in that conference room on a Tuesday in October when a lawyer read my name out loud. Brett has spent his whole life in his father's shadow, learning his father's language, inheriting his father's smallness. I don't say that with cruelty. I say it because I watched it happen in real time, and it is genuinely sad. When you spend decades learning that worth comes from dominance, from exclusion, from being the one who decides who belongs, you don't actually build anything. You just guard what someone else built. And when the person who built it is gone, all you have is the guarding. Jonathan held the door open for me when we walked out of that building. That's such a small thing. He just held the door. But I thought about it on the drive home. Because Douglas never once held a door for my mother. Not because he was always in front, but because the thought simply didn't occur to him. That's the whole story right there. That's the entire architecture of who these two men are. Integrity isn't dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you. It doesn't announce itself. It's not the moment in the conference room, though. That moment was real. It's the 11 years of showing up, of doing the work, of choosing not to let someone else's assessment of you become your own. It's the decision, made quietly and repeatedly, to keep building even when no one is watching and no one is cheering and the only person keeping score is you. My mother kept score. She knew what she was worth, even when the people around her didn't treat her accordingly. She put her name on her parents' money and trusted that eventually the truth of it would matter. It took until after she was gone for it to matter in a legal sense. But I think she knew. I think the watch on her wrist and the way she said we're not poor, we're resourceful. I think that was her keeping score in the only way available to her. I wear her watch now. The clasp is worn. The face is scratched. I wouldn't change a single thing about it.